Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we started a little late. I am Catherine Martucci, Director of Policy and Programs here at the Alliance. For those who are not familiar with us, welcome. We are a nonpartisan resource for the policy community dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding of health policy issues. And thanks for joining today's last installment of our Health Policy Roundup series. If you weren't able to join us for previous briefings in this series, please visit our website where you can watch recordings of those events and access additional resources. Today's session will explain and explore user fee programs and the must-pass reauthorization legislation for Congress this year. And we have an excellent and esteemed group of panelists gathered today that has a range of experience within FDA, Congress, and HHS. So definitely leverage this opportunity to hear about this process from the experts themselves. You can join today's conversation on Twitter as well using the hashtag AllHealthLive and join our community at All Health Policy as well as on Facebook and LinkedIn. And we also will have a Q&A session after some words from our keynote speaker and our panelists. And we want you to be active participants, in the conversation today. So definitely get your questions ready. You should see a dashboard on the right side of your web browser that has a speech bubble icon with a question mark. You can use that speech bubble to submit questions at any time. We will collect these and address them throughout the broadcast. And you can also use that chat to discuss any technical issues you may be experiencing, and someone will attempt to help. Before we dive in, I also want to recognize that this event was made possible with support from Arnold Ventures, and we are grateful to have Kirk Williamson, Healthcare Manager of Drug Prices at Arnold Ventures, to give some quick remarks.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone. We really appreciate all of you joining us today. And a special thank you to the entire Alliance team for pulling together this webinar today. Arnold Ventures is very happy to support the work of the Alliance, and I'm really looking forward to today's important and timely discussion. I'll keep my remarks brief because I know we have a lot to cover today. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Kirk Williamson, and I'm a manager with Arnold Ventures in our drug pricing portfolio. Arnold Ventures is a philanthropy dedicated to tackling some of the most pressing problems in the United States. So we invest in sustainable change based on research and evidence-driven policy, education, and advocacy. Arnold Ventures focuses this work in several portfolios, including criminal justice reform, higher education, public finance, and of course, healthcare. Our objective in healthcare is to lower the cost while maintaining and enhancing access to needed high-quality care. Across the healthcare system, we focus on opportunities to achieve more affordable and equitable care while securing better health outcomes. These focus areas include reducing hospital and physician prices and costs, identifying provider payment incentives to accelerate the shift away from traditional fee-for-service to value-based payment models, and improving the care for Americans with complex health conditions and needs. And of course, the portfolio I work on, lowering prescription drug prices while maintaining incentives for meaningful innovation. We do this by providing grants to many different organizations that conduct research, provide technical assistance, or engage in advocacy campaigns. Our work examines a variety of issues such as anti-competitive behaviors, market distortions, unjustified price increases, ways to strengthen FDA approval standards for certain drugs and biologics, and clinical trial data transparency. We hope today's discussion of the upcoming reauthorization of the User Fee Act provides you all with useful background about the legislation and its potential effect on drug development and FDA regulatory review processes. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Catherine. Thank you all for joining, and I'm excited for this discussion.
Great, thank you, Kirk. And now I'm excited to introduce Amelia Desanto, Executive Vice President of Vend Strategies, who will be leading our conversation today. Amelia brings a wealth of experience, more than 3 decades in federal service, both on Capitol Hill and in various federal agencies. She spent most of her career working in oversight roles as Chief Investigative Counsel and Special Counsel to the Senate Committee on Finance and Chief Investigative Counsel on the Special Committee on Aging. And after she left Capitol Hill, she took a series of high-level posts in the executive branch, at the U.S. Department of State and at the Federal Housing Finance Agency. So very excited to have you here with us today to guide this discussion. I'll turn it over to you, Amelia.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you everyone for joining us today for the final session of the Alliance for Health Policy's Health Policy Roundup series. Well, first I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be the moderator here today for this critical and timely discussion regarding the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, also known as PDUFA. Today, we'll also be touching base with a few other of the user fees that deal with generics, devices, as well as biologics. Well, let's face it, 2022 is not only the year of the tiger and the 30th anniversary of the User Fee Acts. It is also the year that the User Fee Acts must be reauthorized by Congress, and that reauthorization must be completed by September 30th, 2022, the end of the fiscal year. With that in mind, I am pleased to introduce Andy Lipstein-Fristet, Deputy Commissioner for Policy, Legislation, and International Affairs for the Food and Drug Administration, for some opening remarks. Andy provides strategic policy direction to assist in advancing FDA's mission and vision of protecting and promoting public health, and oversees the agency's engagement with Congress and its many global partners, as well as state, local, territorial, and tribal policymakers. Andy joined the FDA in 2021 after nearly a decade in various capacities with the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, fondly known as HELP, first as the Senior Advisor to Chairman Tom Harkin, and later to Ranking Member and Chair Patty Murray. Andy, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much. Really appreciate that, and appreciate the kind introduction. It's an honor to be here today to join you all briefly to talk about the reauthorization of the medical product user fee programs. As this audience is likely aware, the programs which expire this year include the user fees for prescription drugs, or PDUFA, generic drugs, or Gdufa, biosimilars, or BASUFA, and medical devices, or MEDUFA. We were told to spell out all our acronyms, and for this talk, that one, you really get started. It's hard to overstate the role these programs play in providing critical support for FDA's mission to protect the public health and accelerate innovation that benefits patients. In FY21, for example, 46% of FDA's budget was funded by these programs. Americans depend on the agency to review and approve medical products which meet our high scientific standards. FDA's role in providing access to these products is critical to patients and healthcare professionals alike, and to the entire healthcare market. I can say with certainty that FDA's medical product programs would not exist as they are today without these user fee programs. In fact, PDUFA, FDA's very first medical product user fee program, as you just heard, was enacted 30 years ago. A lot has changed in 30 years since then. There's no question that PDUFA revolutionized the United States drug approval process. It has reversed the lag in drug approvals that prompted its creation, providing Americans with more timely access to safe and effective medical products. Before PDUFA 1, the median new drug application, or NDA, approval time averaged 22.2 months. Now in fiscal year 21, the median review time for original first cycle PDUFA applications was under 10 months. More than that, PDUFA is not focused only on providing shorter review times for medicines. It has also allowed FDA to provide more rapid feedback to companies. This feature of the agreement in and of itself has resulted in faster approvals that give Americans access to drugs much sooner. But PDUFA was just the first of the FDA's medical product user fee programs. In the past 30 years, Gdufa, BASUFA, and MEDUFA were enacted to address generic drugs, biosimilars, and medical devices, and have also drastically improved patients' access to medical products that help enhance their lives. Gdufa, for example, was enacted only 10 years ago. Since then, close to 1,000 first generic medicines have been approved, offering patients access to drugs for which there was no previous generic competition. FDA has also approved thousands of additional versions of generic medicines over this time, contributing to significant price reductions for consumers. BsUFA was also enacted 10 years ago. Since BsUFA 1, the number of approved biosimilar products has grown to 33 biosimilars for 11 reference products, including 2 interchangeable biosimilars. Together, Gdufa and BsUFA have allowed FDA to provide access to affordable, safe, and effective medicines to millions of Americans who otherwise couldn't afford them. This equitable access to medical products is a top priority for FDA. Since MDUFA was enacted 20 years ago, FDA has substantially reduced the median time to approve an investigational device exemption study, reduced the average time to reach a decision on a de novo classification request, and has improved the medical device pipeline by ensuring that safe, innovative technologies are introduced in the US earlier than in the past. These achievements across the medical product user fees underscore their importance to the agency and to Americans. And the user fee agreements that we recently transmitted to Congress build significantly on FDA's past successes. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about what's in those agreements. So PDUFA 7 focuses on ensuring FDA has capacity to review new and innovative products. Specifically, the PDUFA 7 commitments include enhancing FDA's capacity to support development, review, and approval of cell and gene therapy products and new allergenic extract products. FDA has seen an 85% increase in original investigational new drug or IND receipts for these products, a 139% increase in IND amendment receipts, and a 158% increase in formal meeting requests in the last 7 years. This commitment includes development of multiple guidances, public meetings, patient-focused drug development meetings, and public outreach to facilitate product development and approval. The commitments also include improving pre-market review processes and procedures. Enhancements to the current system and a new pilot program for certain efficacy supplements would support review earlier to expedite patient access to novel uses for existing therapies. This also includes new performance goals for pre-approval review of post-marketing requirements and a new process for reviewing sponsor-initiated requests. Enhancing regulatory science to expedite drug development is another important focus of PDUFA 7. This includes continuing the successful model-informed drug development and complex innovative design programs, advancing development of drugs for rare diseases, advancing real-world evidence for use in regulatory decision-making, enhancing the use of digital health technologies to support drug development, and furthering the patient voice in drug development. PDUFA 7 would also enhance and modernize the drug safety system, including by modernizing and improving the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy assessments and optimizing the Sentinel initiative capabilities. Under this agreement, FDA would also enhance product quality reviews, chemistry, manufacturing, and controls approaches, and utilization of innovative manufacturing technologies. Finally, the PDUFA 7 commitments further review of combination products. The Gdufa III commitments focus on proposing new processes and procedures to achieve earlier cycle approvals and enhancing the pre-abbreviated new drug application or pre-ANDA program. These include 3 categories. First, ANDA assessments. Here, the focus is on minimizing issuance of complete response letters, extending goal dates for minor issues, and timely regulatory feedback. Second, the commitment letter proposes expanding opportunities for early assessment of drug master files. The agreement will also allow eligible generic drug facilities to request a post-warning letter meeting to obtain preliminary feedback from FDA on corrective action plans. And third, support for the pre-ANDA program and regulatory science to help expedite complex generic drug development. Finally, PDUFA 3 expands upon and refines our current successful commitments and adds some new features. This includes enhancing pre-market review processes, procedures, and performance by proposing new supplement categories, review timelines and performance goals, improving communication and feedback during the development process, and a new follow-up opportunity for sponsors. PDUFA 3 would also enhance biosimilar and interchangeable product development and regulatory science. Under these commitments, the agency would issue guidance on use of alternative tools to assess manufacturing facilities and pending applications, notify sponsors in advance of facility inspections when there's a need to see a product being manufactured, and advance review processes for biosimilar biological device combination products. Importantly, collectively, these three agreements would also improve hiring and retention of key scientific and technical talent. That's really key to all of these programs. Enhance information technology, and strengthen management of user fee resources across the board. I'll say just a word about Gdufa. I know that many of you have been waiting for an announcement on our negotiations on Gdufa V, which are ongoing. When those negotiations have been finalized, we'll communicate with the public about the agreements reached through that negotiation process. The user fee programs have revolutionized medical product review and approval. Without them, hundreds of treatments or cures for life-threatening diseases may not be available to millions of Americans. These programs are critical to FDA's fulfillment of its mission and to the public health. Critical, too, have been the many policies advanced by Congress, which have passed as part of user fee reauthorization packages over the years. Many of these so-called policy riders have given us important authorities which further support FDA's mission in getting treatments and cures to patients. This includes many improvements to pediatric product development, the critical supply chain provisions of FDA, or the enhancements to the generic drug programs in FDARA. FDA's programs and indeed the public health would look very differently today without these important policy advancements. Finally, transparency and public engagement are important aspects of the user fee negotiation process. Our success, both in the past and the future, depends upon collaboration and communication with stakeholders, policymakers, and industry, which is why I'm so glad to stop by this meeting to reiterate FDA's commitment to these programs. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you today as you begin this important conversation.
Thank you very, very much, Andy, for taking the time today and for your insightful comments. Your words are perfect in helping us frame today's conversation, and we'll now let you get back to your very, very busy schedule. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to quickly introduce you to our esteemed panel of experts. Each of these individuals has had a front row seat when it comes to the FDA and the various user fee acts. Our first panelist is Jeremy Sharp. Jeremy is the Managing Director at Waxman Strategies and brings to us a vast policy experience from both the executive and legislative branches of the federal government. He has served as Deputy Commissioner for Policy Planning, Legislation, and Analysis at the FDA, and both as Counselor to the Secretary for Science and Public Health and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislation at HHS. Before working in the executive branch, Jeremy served as the Legislative Director and Senior Health Advisor on the Senate Health Committee. Our second panelist is John Stone. John is a principal at BGR Group and serves as co-lead of the FDA and Public Health Working Group within BGR's Health and Life Sciences practice. John joined the firm after spending nearly 7 years with the House Energy and Commerce Committee, first as a counsel on the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, and then as a senior counsel on the Health Subcommittee, primarily handling issues under FDA's jurisdiction. Our third panelist is Anna Abram. Anna is currently a senior advisor at Aiken Gump. Anna joined Aiken Gump after serving as the Deputy Commissioner for Policy, Legislation, and International Affairs at FDA. Prior to joining the FDA, Anna held roles within the Senate Health Committee and was appointed to serve as the Associate Director of the Domestic Policy Council at the White House. Our panelists will now introduce the topic at hand, and after their presentations, we will get to a question and answer portion of today's event. So Jeremy, first, let's start with you.
Thanks, Amelia, and thank you to the Alliance for hosting this and for all of you for coming. I'm going to open with a little bit of an inside joke, which is to say, it's fun to be on a panel where the two people that succeeded me in the job I had at FDA are on the panel as well. We had Andy, obviously, already speak, who has the job presently, and Anna, who replaced me in that job in 2017. So, John, I think this might give you a clue where your career is going someday, and I think you'll probably make a great Deputy Commissioner for Policy at some point. But let me get on with what's actually you're all here to hear about and talk about.
Too many skeletons.
Yeah, exactly. My role here is to just give a quick layout of what the user fees are, why they're important, and how the administration goes about the process of using them and then ultimately reauthorizing them to key up the congressional debate that is about to begin here in Congress. And it's a great panel to be with because we can all add a lot to all of that conversation. Andy covered some of this, so I'll try to be efficient and not retread too much ground. Very succinctly, user fees are the backbone of funding for FDA's review of all medical products. Without the user fees, the modern FDA simply doesn't exist or function. So there should be no question that these user fees must continue, and they must be funded and reauthorized by Congress by the end of this fiscal year. The resources that user fees provide are substantially impact FDA's ability to be its most effective on the regulation of medical products. And outside of the scientific strength or weakness of the applications FDA receives, or the strength of the science in the field that are backing up those applications, I think that the revenue, the streams that FDA receives from user fees and from appropriations are the single biggest indicator of how effective FDA can be as they continue to carry out their mission to protect us and to facilitate access to needed drugs and devices. And very succinctly, where FDA gets user fees, FDA can do a substantially greater job. In the areas where there are no user fees at FDA, those are the areas where the program staff and the program leadership have to prioritize more ruthlessly and are faced with much harder choices about where they spend their time and energy. Because if without those user fees, without that revenue, they are sometimes not able to focus on that. And so I think that's something we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about these user fee programs in a reauthorization year. And finally, the negotiations between industry and FDA, and then ultimately between members of Congress and the stakeholder community, are the place where everything is decided about how FDA spends the money that comes from those user fees. And there's a substantial push and pull that happens there, and it's important for people who want to understand how FDA works to pay attention to those negotiations and understand that push and pull. Because these resources are so central to FDA's work, which is frankly an obvious statement, they're also central to what I think are the two biggest questions about FDA policy in general, and that have pervaded every FDA debate for the last decade that I'm aware of. One is, how much of a gatekeeper should the agency be in terms of drugs and medical products? And how should they balance the need to be protective of the public and protective of public health versus the consideration of what is the access to market of experimental products with or without rigorous testing? Those balances and those questions are underscored by the user fee debate and influenced by it. But I will say, while there's some people who would suggest that the user fees may create imbalances in that process, I don't think the user fees are the cause of those questions. And that's a distinction we need to understand. But I will talk a little bit about that in a little bit. I'll skip over a little bit of the funding questions because Andy covered them really well, but very succinctly, one thing that I want to make sure people are aware of is, for the human drug regulatory operation, about 65% of the budget for the human drug process at FDA is funded by user fees. And that gets even bigger when you focus in on the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, where it's more like 80%. So there is a substantial amount of revenue that is there coming from user fees, and they are the core to the work. As Andy said, these programs started in 1992 with PDUFA. They've been expanded since then. They're negotiated and renegotiated every 5 years. And after those negotiations happen, the industries that are regulated by FDA pony up resources that FDA then uses to ensure that the products they're reviewing are safe and effective. The reason for the user fee agreements back in 1992 and throughout the intervening years has been because, frankly, Congress and the administrations of both parties have not been willing to appropriate the level of funding necessary to fund the agency. And so it's really important to understand that this is not something where you can have a choice. Oh, should we have the user fees or shouldn't we? You can't, because Congress won't appropriate that level of funding to this agency to carry out its mission. Beyond the basic medical product user fees, FDA has user fees in a number of areas that this webinar is not about, but I just want to make sure people are aware of them. Tobacco products, animal drugs, over-the-counter drugs. There's a variety of places where FDA takes that revenue in, but we're here talking about the medical products and particularly the drugs in this place. Within the user fees, there are a few different kinds of user fees that are collected. As I said, these are negotiated and renegotiated every 5 years. Their structure changes, the amount changes from cycle to cycle. But ultimately, the categories of user fees that industry pays are application fees when they submit an application to FDA. There are a few different types of these. Program fees for when they have a biosimilar development program or they have a prescription drug program. And then establishment or facility fees that help resource FDA's understanding of the manufacturing and the development facilities. A few clarifications of some of what is and isn't covered by a user fee. The expenditure of the user fee fund by FDA is not specific to the applications they come in associated with. They are aggregated into a pot of money for prescription drugs, and aggregated into a pot of money for medical devices, aggregated into a pot of money for generic drugs, and so forth. And they are used to fund the regulatory program. They hire the staff, they pay for the IT. Andy rattled off the various things that they go to, but they are not tied to, say, Pfizer's application for X drug. Pfizer pays its fee for and submits that application, but it doesn't get, in compensation for that, specific things that happen on its application. It gets no guarantees about whether or not that application will meet all these goals. That's because this is also tied to aggregate goals. And an example of a goal, performance goal, that FDA uses for this is that they will complete review and final action on 90% of applications within 10 months. So that gives them flexibility to decide, okay, this application is more complicated, or there are real public health questions that we need to understand, or the data here isn't strong, so we're going to choose a different path for that application. But it also ensures that FDA is moving along very rapidly and focused on its overall performance and making sure the management of its program is at a high level. The expenditure user fee is also not associated with the approval of a product. It's all about final actions, or it's about process steps along the way. This is not, there's no guarantee that if a drug company pays a user fee, that it will get a drug approved at the end of the process. What it gets is process. And that's a really important thing to understand about this. The user fees allow the industry to finance FDA's activities, but they are process oriented. They do not dictate FDA's policy. So with that kind of flexibility, FDA has a lot of ability to manage this. There's one other caveat I want to flag about user fees that is sometimes not well understood. They are tied to something called the appropriations trigger. When Congress established this program, they thought it was really important. Various sides thought it was very important that the user fee dollars not replace taxpayer dollars that were being appropriated through FDA. They didn't want to see a backslide in this. And this has been important also in the new user fees that were created. I know especially on the generic drug user fee program in the second round of reauthorization, the industry was very concerned that they wanted to make sure that that trigger was high enough that they felt like they were not just paying the whole boat of the regulatory process. And that appropriation trigger does increase from year to year based on inflation. But even with that appropriation trigger, we have seen the user fees represent a greater and greater percentage of the revenue that covers and the funding that covers the regulatory program. And we've seen, and we've frankly seen some discussion about whether or not we should go one direction or the other. It was at least rumored in the Trump administration that they were going to push to have the government, the FDA, completely funded by user fees and have no federal appropriations for it. I don't know that it actually ever got proposed in a budget. It clearly didn't go anywhere in Congress. There's also people pushing the other direction, wanting to lessen the role of user fees and increase the appropriated spending. And these are the kinds of debates that surround the user fee reauthorization from year to year. A quick note about what's the process by which the administration develops the user fee agreements and brings them to Congress for the appropriation, for the reauthorization process. Very quickly, every year, the FDA publishes annual reports on its performance metrics tied to the user fees and its expenditures tied to the user fees. These are really useful documents for those of you who really want to dig in and understand what's happening year to year. The wonks on Capitol Hill and in the stakeholder community who are paying attention to it, take a look at those reports every year and try to understand the direction of the program and the issues that are involved. Beyond that, we think of, some of us on the outside think of the reauthorization process as being a one-year process on Capitol Hill and John is going to talk more about what's involved in that, but in truth, it's really more like a 3-year process that has started 2 years before that. 2 years prior to the need to submit the agreements to Congress, the administration starts sorting through, the agency starts sorting through what are its priorities going to be in its upcoming negotiations with industry. Where does it need to expand the program? Where does it need to make improvements? Where have they had failings in the performance of the program, and what should they be hoping to ask the industry for? They'll do some consultation with industry and stakeholder in that process. Then after that happens, you start to have public meetings and open dockets and congressional briefings so that FDA can receive input from various players about what those priorities should be. And FDA identifies its internal ratifiers, the senior officials who will sign off on or ask questions about the negotiations as they are progressing. And then ultimately the negotiations begin. And a change that's happened in the process of this over the years, partly because of work that Anna and others have done, is that the negotiation process is more public than it used to be. The meetings themselves are not public. They are meetings between industry and FDA, but the minutes of those meetings are generally published shortly after the meeting so the public can be aware of what's happening in them. And alongside of those negotiation sessions, there are now stakeholder engagement meetings where FDA briefs the stakeholder community that's interested in what's going on in those negotiations, receives feedback on where those are going, and incorporates that feedback into their thinking. It's not a perfect process. There are probably improvements that can be made from year to year, and there are probably variances from cycle to cycle about how effective that process is at drawing in that feedback. But it is there, and there is a public engagement component to it. Finally, once negotiation happens, they have to go through an internal clearance process. FDA, HHS, and OMB all get their say. That can be a little harrowing inside, and then they're published for comment. And then they're submitted to Congress in January, unless they're the medical device user fees, which are almost always published late and submitted late because that negotiation is always fraught. Last couple thoughts, and then I'll hand it off. When we're thinking about user fees, I've highlighted one question: should they or shouldn't they exist? And that's one that's there. I think one question that comes up is, do user fees really lead to industry capture of the agency? I think that's an accusation that's made. And I will just put a finger on the scale and say, I don't believe that they do lead to industry capture. They are one element of the interaction between industry and FDA, but frankly, I think a much greater influence on the agency's design, policies and thoughts about how they are going to, what standards they're going to hold industry to in the applications they receive is where congressional and political pressure is. And congressional pressure has for the entire time that I've been working on this been tilted very heavily in the direction of more innovation, more faster reviews, impatience with the process and steps. And that's been also paired with, somewhat not consistently, a very low tolerance for failure when FDA screws up and approves something it shouldn't or allows the drug on the market. There are a couple of things that people should watch for as this process unfolds. Watch out for linkages between the user fees and approvals. That kind of linkage is where you start to get in trouble. Second, what happens to the timelines in these user fees? Are they getting shorter and shorter over time, or are they starting to stay consistent? That can add pressure to the process at FDA. And then what other issues are surfaced within them? Like I said, the user fee won't dictate FDA's policy, but their focus on things like real-world evidence, the patient voice, breakthrough drugs and devices, biomarkers, surrogate endpoints, the idea that the user fees say that those kinds of issues will be made in guidances, that gives you some indication of what direction the agency is being pushed to go, and it is something to pay attention to if you want to consider how the user fees impact the agency. So with that, let me hand it off. Sorry for talking so long.
Jeremy, thank you very, very much. Now just handing this over to John Stone. John, all yours.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. I will be talking about how the sausage is actually made. So once industry and agency finalize the agreements and they go through the process that Jeremy laid out, those commitment letters will be sent to the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Help Committee in the Senate, which are FDA's authorizing committees. Those committee staffers will have been briefed by FDA and industry as those conversations play out. But once they're finalized, they'll be sent to the Hill. They need to be transmitted by statute by January 15th, but as has been discussed, MDUFA is still outstanding. Proposed legislative language is also sent to the Hill that would amend the statute authorizing FDA to collect those fees for the next 5 years, setting out the new fee structure, the year-over-year amounts, and any sort of reporting requirements that are included in the agreements. It's important to note that everything agreed to in the negotiations in terms of new activities like pilot programs or new guidance documents that the agency agrees to issue must all be done within current statutory authority. So once those agreements are sent to the Hill, the legislative language is proposed. Congress doesn't typically substantively alter the agreements or the language. Those 4 pieces, PDUFA, Gdufa, BSUFA, and MDUFA, will become the first 4 titles of the legislative package that needs to be signed into law by September 30th. The legislative process always differs a little bit, cycle after cycle. The House really kicked off their process in earnest yesterday with hearings on the 3 drug agreements, where the CDER and CBER center directors testified on a first panel on the hearings, and stakeholders testified on the agreements on a second panel. Help has been not entirely clear when they're going to have their kickoff hearing. They typically have had all 4 agreements at one hearing where the center directors will testify, and then a subsequent hearing where stakeholders across the industry and patient and consumer communities will testify. But given that MDUFA is outstanding, I don't know exactly how that's going to play out over there. So I guess in parallel or ongoing, as the 2 committees are having hearings on the actual agreements, there'll be FDA related bills that have been introduced. There'll likely be a hearing or hearings on these discrete FDA bills that members are trying to have included in this UFA package, right? These are the so-called policy riders that folks have referenced. In the House, historically, in order for policy rider to really be debated and considered as something that could be included into the user fee package, it needs to have been introduced on its own, right? So a lot of folks have referenced Cures 2.0. There's a lot of various provisions, some touching FDA, some unrelated to FDA and Cures 2.0. For those FDA provisions to really be included or considered as something that could be included, they would need to be introduced separately. They really need to be bipartisan to be considered. I keep referencing the need for them to be FDA specific. That's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. There were some controlled substances related provisions I recall in 2012, for example, and they really need to be non-controversial. It doesn't mean they need to start without controversy or various, without folks having various views on them. Sometimes, quite different views, but ultimately they need to get to the point where they're relatively non-controversial and there's, you know, buy-in on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Capitol, because, you know, the first order of business is to get these user fee programs reauthorized well in advance of this September 30th deadline. Everything else is kind of icing on the cake. Anything that could get in the way of votes in either chamber is not going to ultimately be included. So again, the processes in the House and the Senate vary a little bit based on the rules and just based on, you know, the cadence of either chamber, but there'll be constant communication between the Energy and Commerce staff and the Health Committee staff about the issues that both sides are working on. Typically, there'll be a lot of overlap. There could be some priorities in the House that are not as big of priorities in the Senate and vice versa, but you know, typically these issues will either have been introduced as bills in both chambers or will be, you know, significantly discussed in both chambers. Then the markups occur, and that's where really this is all packaged together. So on the House side, there'll be a subcommittee markup and a full committee markup. Dates on those TBD. You know, we've heard that the House wants to, you know, have all of this on the floor around Memorial Day. I think with Gdufa outstanding, that timeline will likely slip, but we'll see. So again, at the subcommittee markup is where they will pull those 4 user fee components together, first 4 titles of the bill, and it could be an opportunity for there to be policy riders that are pulled in that were discussed at previous markups. That might have to wait until full committee, but by the time Energy and Commerce reports out its product from full committee for floor consideration, a lot of, you know, what we call pre-conferencing will have occurred between the House and Senate. The goal here is for, you know, for each chamber to have to only vote on this once, right? You know, there's always going to be a need for cleanup after the markups, given you know, differences of opinion between chambers or just technical issues that have arisen. But all that will occur prior to that House floor vote, which will likely occur before the Senate vote. The Senate doesn't need, for procedural reasons, the Health Committee at least, and Anna can speak, you know, more to this, but they don't typically need to have as much public-facing process as Energy and Commerce does. There'll likely be just one markup that's kind of pre-orchestrated, for lack of a better term, before they vote their package out. And again, you know, both committees' product is going to look pretty similar, with the goal of just avoiding multiple votes in each chamber. The last go around in 2017, the whole package was voted off the House floor with a voice vote on the suspension calendar, where you need 2/3 vote of the chamber. You need even to, you know, have it on suspension. I don't think that's going to happen this go around. There likely will need to be a recorded vote. There are a lot of new members in the House, in particular, who were not here 5 years ago. So the floor vote is certainly going to be interesting, and I think that, you know, that dynamic will certainly influence the scope of the package. I mean, the bigger the package gets, you know, beyond just the user fee components, the dicier that House floor vote gets. So I do think that this will be a relatively tight package with respect to ancillary matters being included. That being said, there are a lot of you know, policy riders that are already out there, some of which have been introduced, some of which likely will be introduced. A lot of these issues were discussed at the Energy and Commerce hearing yesterday. Obviously, a lot of noise around potential accelerated approval reforms, a lot of conversation around real world evidence, you know, building off of what was in 21st Century Cures, FDARA, components of this PDUFA agreement. A lot of conversation around inspections and recall authority. And then there are these so-called super riders that folks are discussing, not necessarily in the drug side, but the VALID Act has certainly been, the subject of significant activity and debate that would comprehensively reform how diagnostic tests are regulated, cosmetics reform, dietary supplements reform. I mean, all of these are pretty big ticket issues, each of which have a lot of different views. Folks have a lot of different views on. So that's a lot of work for the committees to get done between now and when they want to actually get this legislation to the president's desk. Not saying it can't be done. When there's a will, there's a way, and particularly with Senator Burr being the lead Republican sponsor of the VALID Act, I certainly wouldn't dismiss that effort at all. So I'll stop there. Again, a lot of this is crystal balling, but based on how past cycles have gone, that's more or less how I envision the next few months playing out.
Well, thank you very, very much, John. We always like to hear about how you make sausage. And now I'm just going to turn this over to Anna.
Great. Thanks, Amelia, for the introduction, and thank you to the Alliance for Health Policy for hosting today's panel. So I've been asked to kind of focus on reflections. So what have we learned in the almost 30 years since Congress enacted the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which is commonly referred to as PDUFA, as you've heard today? And why does the reauthorization of PDUFA, Gdufa, and BsUFA matter? The FDA's mission is to protect and promote public health, and the agency's user fee-funded medical product activities is an integral part of fulfilling this public health mission for patients and consumers. And because of the critical role the user fee programs play in supporting the timely review of medical products, there is understandably a great deal of interest in the reauthorization of these programs because of what they mean for patients, industry, the agency, and public health. So Congress is now considering PDUFA 7, or the 6th reauthorization of this law. And for some of you, this may be the first time you are learning about FDA's user fee programs and the role the UFA reauthorization plays in the development and review of prescription drugs, generic drugs, and biosimilar biological products. There is a lot at stake with the reauthorization of these programs, and that's why they go through such an iterative process and receive the broad attention they do from so many stakeholders: patients, industry, the agency, Congress, and many others. So over the years, Congress has enhanced the transparency, reporting, and opportunity for public input in the reauthorization process in response to the high level of interest in the user fee programs. Inherent to the user fee programs and the process by which these programs are reauthorized is a recognition that the time it takes to develop, review, and approve safe and effective medicines impacts public health. Unnecessary delays in the approval of safe and effective products can adversely impact patients. So patients are highly vested in the time it takes for safe and effective therapies to be developed, reviewed, and made available. PDUFA was in part a response to concerns about the time it was taking for FDA to review drug applications and the level of staff and resources needed to support more timely and predictable review. PDUFA was a direct response to the concerns from patients that potentially promising drugs were stuck at the agency, and the experience of the AIDS crisis was a turning point in catalyzing reforms to address these concerns, as well as the agency's tools with respect to unmet medical needs. In the years that followed enactment of PDUFA, the user fee resources enabled a more modern and efficient approach to FDA's review of new drug applications, and in a manner consistent with FDA's gold standards. So to put a finer point on this, before PDUFA, the time it was taking FDA to review and approve new drug applications was an average of more than 31 months. And you contrast that timeline to the performance goals in the PDUFA 7 commitment level, which include the goal for FDA to review and act on new drug applications in 6 months for priority drugs and 10 months for standard drugs. For a patient facing a difficult diagnosis, the difference between 30 months, and 6 months is even more pronounced. So one key takeaway as reauthorization is considered is that PDUFA demonstrated that there was public health benefit to aligning resources to the agency's workload, and this came in the form of user fees supplementing, not supplanting, general appropriations. And with this PDUFA experience in mind, 10 years ago, Congress enacted user fee programs for generic drugs and biosimilars with the purpose of aligning resources to workloads to support a modern and efficient review process for these products. The fact that Congress is now considering PDUFA 7, Gdufa III, and Gdufa III is a testament to the integral role of these user fee programs and public health benefit they are providing. Congress could have decided not to reauthorize these programs in previous years and instead pursue another legislative framework for supporting these activities, but that's not what has happened. And since the enactment of PDUFA, Gdufa, and BsUFA, Congress has reauthorized these programs, and in doing so, also advanced FDA-related reforms as part of the reauthorization legislative packages. Another key takeaway is the importance of regulatory certainty, which is important for everyone involved in the development and review of medical products. The user fees have fostered enhanced regulatory certainty with respect to the review process for industry, patients, and stakeholders, as well as the agency. And while user fees support review activities, as you've heard from others on the panel today, they do not determine FDA's regulatory decisions. The path to bringing forward a safe and effective medicine is not just contingent upon the time it takes for FDA to review a new drug application, a biologics license application, abbreviated new drug application, or biosimilar or interchangeable biosimilar application. Drug development reflects scientific advancement, challenges, and opportunities. And one of the ways that FDA can help to enhance regulatory certainty is to issue guidance on various topics that can inform the development of products. Commitments to issuing guidance to share the agency's current and best thinking on various topics has been included in commitment letters. As PDUFA performance goals for the review times of drugs has decreased and stabilized over the course of the previous reauthorizations, there has also been the integration of commitments regarding the timing and type of meetings FDA will hold with industry as part of the development and review process, as well as the incorporation of commitments to issue certain guidance documents within certain timeframes. But these types of actions can also help to enhance regulatory certainty to the process of bringing forward products. One of the defining features of the reauthorization process is that the agency, industry, patients, stakeholders, and Congress come together every 5 years to reauthorize the programs versus other public health programs that do not have a similar mechanism for reauthorization. The current programs being set to expire at the end of the fiscal year lends a particular urgency and sense of must pass to the reauthorization process. The 5-year reauthorization cycles set up a regular cadence for the agency, industry, Congress, and stakeholders to come together and examine what is working well and where there is room for improvement, with the goal of optimizing these programs for public health benefit. These discussions are directly informed by prior years' experiences with the user fee program. This cadence is also very important because of the nature of scientific advancement. The question of what modern and efficient development and review looks like today is in some ways different than what it looked like 30 years ago, or will likely look like 10 years from now. The agency has to be prepared for whatever comes before it, and that includes the ability to keep pace with the products coming before the FDA for review and having the workforce necessary to support the anticipated workload. This is one reason that hiring is a consistent and continual focus across user fee reauthorization. The dynamics of a 5-year period in between reauthorizations, coupled with the pace at which science is advancing, enables an ongoing dialogue about how best to support FDA's work in these areas as part of its public health mission on behalf of patients and consumers. Because the reauthorizations are considered must-pass, the bill that carries them is often an attractive vehicle for advancing related policy writers. Every member of Congress has patients as constituents. How the final bill comes together is a reflection of member priorities, as well as the need to enact the reauthorization before the current programs expire in order to avoid any programmatic disruption that could adversely impact patients. And so the process of reauthorizing the user fee programs is fundamentally about answering the question of how to have the most modern, efficient, and timely development and review of medical products so that patients have the potential to benefit from safe and effective therapies as soon as possible. And that will bring me to where I began my remarks, which is to say that there's a lot at stake with each reauthorization, first and foremost for patients and public health.
Well, thank you very, very much, Anna. And I want to thank our panelists for their opening remarks. We're now coming to the question and answer portion of our webinar. Again, we encourage everyone in the audience to please submit questions in the chat feature. And as we're compiling those questions, we're just going to start the question and answer period immediately as questions come up, and we'll take them one at a time. Jeremy, this question is for you. And Anna, I think you could also contribute here. I think actually so can John. Why should members care about PDUFA? Why should they care about that? What's the so what?
Yeah,
Jeremy.
Yeah, I'll go first. I think all three of us have touched on this, but just to underscore it, I mean, at a fundamental level, it is, and PDUFA in particular, but it's true of all the UFOs. This is the centerpiece of funding for FDA and its work. And as Anna said, that it has had dramatic impact and positive impact on the agency in terms of its ability to respond to applications that are coming in and facilitate products making it to market that are needed and wanted by patients and consumers. So at the most basic level, that's really important. But it's also becomes a roadmap for what the next few years of policy development is going to be. Where are the discussions going to be? Even though you don't, within the four corners of the user fees, define policy, you set direction and you underscore the areas you want to focus on, and you tee up the legislative vehicle that John was talking about that just carries so many other policy discussions and debates. So this is going to be an engine that basically drives FDA policy for the next 5 years and will drive legislative discussion of that policy for the next 8 months.
Anna, would you like to add to what Jeremy just said?
I'll just add to kind of further expand upon what I noted in my remarks is, ultimately all of this work comes down to what's the impact to patients, in terms of where there's unmet medical need or the ability to have more competition, perhaps, because you've got more products to be able to choose from, depending upon which program you're looking at. And so kind of coming back, I think fundamentally you're asking, why does it matter? For all the reasons kind of outlined before, but again, it comes down to the time and path for those products, right, that are going to meet FDA standard, the time it takes then for them to be potentially available to patients, and that's a big deal. That's a very big deal. And it should not be. I would just further add to put a finer point on this, and to build off of what Jeremy said around, if you were to contemplate suddenly not having these resources and not having that piece of the engine, if you will, what would that look like? And when you start to contemplate that, it kind of comes back, in my mind, to why PDUFA was established. Now on the 30th anniversary of this, it was to construct a process that lent itself, not to predetermined outcomes, but to greater certainty around the process so that it could be more streamlined.
Well, let's just take a moment and just also try and discuss the elephant in the room. We know that 3 decades ago, user fees were implemented, and in 2022, they generated almost $3 billion for FDA. That's real money, okay? Critics have and continue to raise concerns, arguing that these funds buy influence, and as a result, FDA is not as independent as it could be, and drug safety and efficacy suffer as a result. On the other side of the coin, proponents, as we, proponents say that there would be untold delays for critical new therapies to get to market without these user fees. Countless individuals would suffer unnecessarily, as well as other, I'll call, undesirable downstream effects. Is there a way, or should we be considering better ways to balance these competing priorities? And what measures are currently in place for balancing these trade-offs? John, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think regardless of how you get there, everyone benefits from a strong, efficient, nimble agency that can keep the pace of the science. I think irrespective of the funding mechanism, there is constant oversight from Congress of the agency. They get various viewpoints on what's going right, what's going poorly, where there needs to be specific attention and discussion around the need for change, divorced from the user fee mechanisms, quite frankly. And so I do think the oversight of the agency is strong. I think that conversation around regulatory capture or the right balance is often hyperbolic. I haven't seen it. I was at the oversight committee. I was on the authorizing side. There's a healthy tension there. There's robust and ample opportunity for congressional involvement, and I think everyone wants a strong FDA. So,
thank you, Jeremy. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to say I don't think there's a culture at FDA of being too close to industry or in general. I think FDA is well designed as an institution to resist political and external pressure. It is very, like, one of my experience working there after working on Capitol Hill was that the personnel there are deeply committed to reviewing science and evidence and basing their decisions on that. So there are obviously outliers, there are obviously things that happen. And I don't think the user fees themselves alter that equation much. What I would say is, in addition to that, is first of all, everyone at FDA knows that industry can't afford to lose the user fee program either, right? So it's not like industry has this stick that they can hold over FDA's head and walk away from. So it's not actually an effective tool for forcing FDA to behave in a certain way on any given regulatory decision. But the user fees do create a timeline pressure, right? Which is, if FDA is trying to make sure that 90% of the applications that come in are completed within 6 months or 10 months or whatever the agreement is, that creates a mentality of, okay, we got to move. And generally, that's not a bad thing. Like that as Anna and John both pointed out, that accelerates the progress of treatments and medications to the public. But in specific cases, it can become a problem if FDA isn't programmed well to manage that. And that's where I think it is really important for Congress to balance its messages to FDA between the, yes, we want you to move quickly, yes, we don't want you to be unnecessarily in the way, but we also don't want you to get this wrong. We want you to make sure you're making the right decisions. And I'm not sure that balance has always been exactly right in the communications from Congress and from the political appointees in either party, right? This is not a partisan piece. This is both parties have had the same message. So
Anna?
That alters things.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
I'll just jump in here to build off of something Jeremy touched upon, and I also did in my opening remarks around, if you look at the iterations and the evolution of the user fee reauthorizations and kind of this cycle and this cadence, we've also seen over the past 30 years a very thoughtful and concerted effort to expand upon, the opportunity for public input, right? And transparency and accountability and reporting around this to a bit open the aperture, if you will, around, what are these resources being put towards and what's the agency's performance. And I think that that's something that we've seen kind of each additional reauthorization has built upon the one that has gone before, in the spirit of, is there more opportunity for that, and what would that look like?
Thank you very much. Another question. We heard a little bit earlier about Gdufa and the delay in Gdufa, and wanted to see if we could have a few more details on what's causing that delay. Is there just more controversy around Gdufa? Jeremy, I saw you shaking your head, so I'll call on you first.
So with the caveat, I don't really, and I don't know if either of my colleagues have any insight into what's happening on the inside of the negotiation. Gdufa, in my experience, has always been the problem child renegotiation. It's a more tense negotiation. I think the industry as a whole is less confident of the value of the user fees to them. And what I mean by that is I think the industry as a whole believes there's value to paying these user fees, but I think there's sometimes disagreement about what's the marginal value of each increase in the user fee. And I also think there's some differences in the way the Center for Drugs and Center for Biologics and the Center for Devices have approached their negotiations in the past. And I think occasionally the Center for Devices comes in with a longer list of asks that need to be worked out between the industry and the center. Lastly, I'll say I think there may be less unanimity within the industry about where they want to go on this than there may exist in some of the other industries. We saw this a lot actually with the second round of Gdufa, where the industry had to sort of figure out where it wanted to be. The third round of Gdufa has gone, my understanding, went very, very smoothly. So there's differences in development in timeline for different industries. But I'd love to hear what the others say if they have any thoughts or insight.
I was just going to ask. John?
I would just.
Oh, I'm sorry, Anna, go please.
John, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm not privy to the state of the negotiations. I would note that, the Gdufa letter didn't reach the Hill, I don't think, until March or maybe even April in 2012. And, at the end of the day, all was well that ended well. I think everyone got a little nervous there, but, there's time.
There's time. Anna.
I was actually going to share the same observation that there have been prior reauthorization cycles where letters did not come up in January, and things still carried forward. But I would also make the observation, it's reflected in the commitment letters that have gone to the Hill thus far, is that each of these programs, prescription drugs, generic drugs, biosimilars, and then devices as well, they're each their own program, and so there are considerations that may transcend across all of these user fee programs, and you see those themes consistently around, say, hiring and retention and some of the reporting and the patient involvement, the patient voice. But you then also see individual commitment letters that are tailored to and reflective of each of those programs in its own way.
Thank you very, very much. We just received a question from the audience that they would like a little bit of a further explanation on the appropriations triggers. We kind of went through how the process works and how much work goes on prior to appropriations, prior to Congress's involvement. John, would you like to take that?
I think Jeremy or Anna may be better suited.
That's fine. That's fine.
I thought Jeremy explained it very well in your remarks. Yeah.
Well, Jeremy, it's all yours.
so with the clarity that I don't think any of us ever worked on the Appropriations Committee, so there's some challenges there. Loosely, I think the appropriations trigger is based on sort of what's the prior year's program funding from the appropriations. Like, so there's a sort of baseline rule of you don't ever want to allow fewer appropriations or less appropriations, I don't know what the right grammatical term there is, than the prior year. And then you have some sort of inflationary adjustment to it, usually. And then I think depending on and Anna captured this well, that there are very big differences between the programs and the individual letters. So depending on the program and depending on the industry's interest in what percentage they are willing to cover of the program, there may be a higher or lower target of the trigger versus the size and scale of the fees. Right. So how much of in Gdufa, a very high percentage of the program is funded by the user fees themselves, and the appropriations trigger, while increasing every year, is still a lower and lower percentage of the program. And that's because the prescription drug industry, the brand name drug industry, is very, very confident of what the business value is to them and to their customers of investing these user fees, right? In Gdufa and in BsUFA, that's less clear, right? And those programs, and the BsUFA program is far less developed than the PDUFA program. So I would guess over time, you will see that percentage shift, but the appropriations trigger will probably look pretty much the same as a sort of inflationary adjusted number over time.
Okay, thank you. I think there was mention of possible policy writers, and some questions from the audience surround that issue. And the question is, and this is posed to all three of you, what do you think are most likely to be discussed and possibly included in this process with regard to the policy writers? Looking into your crystal balls. John.
Yeah, well, you typically look to the hearings and what members raise in the hearings, either, in reference to bills of theirs they've already introduced or just topics that are priorities. And judging by yesterday's hearing at Energy and Commerce, as I mentioned, it's clear that, there's a discussion to be had about accelerated approval and whether that pathway needs to be, right-sized or optimized or reformed or whatever, term you want to use. Obviously, a lot of noise around accelerated approval, even at the hearing yesterday was on the coverage side of the equation, and CMS and coverage related reforms are really not germane to an FDA user fee package. So is there a conversation around FDA related reforms to accelerated approval? Likely. Clinical trial diversity and modernizing clinical trial structures, incorporating more real world evidence. So a lot of this stuff doesn't necessarily need new statutory authority, but will likely be discussed in legislative terms, and I could see being riders. Obviously, all of the FDA-related provisions in 21st or Cures 2.0, and also in this Health Pandemic Preparedness Package, I think are ripe for consideration. Pediatric drug and device-related regulatory reforms are always issues that perennially pop up. I mentioned, the non-drug related, big non-drug related super riders, as they're being called, valid cosmetic supplements. I mean, it does involve a lot of crystal balling, and again, for a variety of reasons, I think the dynamics this go around lend themselves to a tighter package. So how all of those issues are litigated at both committees and ultimately resolved, I don't know, but just to name a few.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tom. Well, I think the VALID Act was mentioned as a possible rider on the user fee legislation. Is there bipartisan or bicameral support for that bill? Who would like to take that?
Yeah, it's bipartisan and bicameral. Obviously, it's introduced in both chambers, and there's an R&D top, and
so it's looking pretty good. Okay. Okay.
It's a 200+ page piece of legislation, right, in and of itself. So yes, to answer your question, it's bipartisan and bicameral, but a lot of feverish debate will certainly proceed related to the VALID Act.
We noted earlier that the user fees are now 30 years old. Okay, and if just to summarize, if we were to identify what is working well, what is expanded, and what should be dropped, one item, what would you say, Anna?
It's a good question. In my experience, and Jeremy alluded to this, I think the transparency piece around this is really important, and the opportunities for patient input, right? And stakeholder input. And I think, with each, as I mentioned before, each reauthorization has come back to is there another element that can be built in to continue to foster really a collaborative conversation, right? And being able to capture that patient experience, that patient input, and that certainly extends to then, as Jeremy touched upon, it becomes a predictor here for areas of priority and focus, which isn't to say that there won't be other areas, right, that are looked at. But, one of the difficulties in public health is, with finite time and resources, how do you prioritize? And so I think there is a value of people feeling like they've had an opportunity to weigh in. And of course, that can also come in the nature of the packages moving through Congress, right? You have elected officials who represent you. You can meet with them and bring forward ideas. But, oftentimes when you go through this, if you can reach the end of it and say there's a lot of support for where you landed, it's a reflection of the consensus, right? That these are areas that are hard and meaningful and are worthy of being a commitment, right? That this is going to be focused on, versus, the alternative of saying, well, we disagree with that. We really think it should be other areas. And so I don't know that I have the perfect answer, right, to what that looks like, but I think that that's an important element with each of the reauthorizations, is to look at that and think through, could there be more done in that?
Right. John, your thoughts on what's working, maybe what should be expanded and what should be dropped?
That's a hard question to answer. I'm sure there are a lot of transparency is always a good thing, right? Are there some reports that are probably really burdensome for FDA to, compile that are kind of, sent in and then sit on a desk somewhere and collect dust? Probably. So I've never worked at FDA, but if there are any FDA folks on the line, I'm sure they'll be applauding me for saying that. But there's probably some underbrush that involves a lot of work that may not ultimately, lead to anything. So if there's any sort of antiquated reports that are required to be produced, maybe folks could give them a look.
Get rid of get rid of those mandated reports that take a whole lot of resources that no one reads. I got it. Jeremy, would you like to add to the conversation on this?
I think the user review process itself works pretty well, right? It's a good mechanism. It's process oriented by and large, so it keeps the focus away from policy, which needs to be much more public. I do think there's probably more room for the user fee negotiations to be a little bit more engageable by stakeholders and besides industry, because I think there's a little bit, at a fundamental level, they have to be closed doors, but are there other ways to improve that visibility so that stakeholders can engage in them a little more directly? Because usually what happens, stakeholders sort of engage now, and the agreements are already kind of done. So it's a little, there's some that engage earlier, but I also, I'm going to just join my colleagues in saying there are lots of reports that are of minimal value. They are wonderful legislative compromises for Congress to direct the agency to give them some information on something they need because they can't agree on something to do. But the work that goes into it, my biggest learning from being at FDA, and I don't know if this is, John has observed FDA very closely from the outside, and Anna had sort of the same transition in that I did, was that it takes a lot more time to do all of the work that the agency does than I anticipated. It takes more personnel, it takes more resources, and that even with the budget it has, which is pretty good, it's constrained. And so I do think there's a need for Congress to think about which things is it asking the agency to prioritize and spend its time and energy on, and which not. We've seen user fee agreements have real issues in that front before, but the process itself, I think, is mostly pretty good. And the legislative process is maybe the last vestige of pretty close to regular order, I'm just a bill lawmaking that goes on in today's Congress. So I wouldn't throw that out either.
Fair enough. We've said, throughout the conversation here that these user fee acts are must pass legislation, okay? It's must pass legislation. What happens if the user fee program is not reauthorized by September 30th? And what are the implications on pharma and payers and providers? What if it doesn't happen? We've seen a lot of anomalies over the years. We've all been on the Hill for a lot of years. Strange things happen sometimes. Who'd like to take that question?
Well, so when 2 cycles ago, when I was on the Hill trying to do one of these, we got very close to that moment. And one of the immediate things that happens is and I can't remember how close you have to get to the deadline for this moment, but there is a point where FDA is required by law and by agreement with its employees to send out notices that there is a high degree of danger that their job will have to be furloughed or ended if there's a halt in funding. And the act of sending that out is highly disruptive to the efficient operation of the people who are working at FDA. So if we get that deadline, you're going to start disrupting the way FDA works. If we get past that deadline and the user fee funding is not gone, people are being furloughed and the entire review process will slow down to a crawl, right? So there has to be funding. If it's temporary funding, like a CR kind of thing.
Right, exactly.
But this is where Anna's points about hiring are really important. You can't do the hiring that you need to do on this. You can't retain personnel well if there's uncertainty about where this funding is coming from. That's why the 5-year reauthorization cycle is so good, is that you've got this dedicated funding that, you know, if the government shuts down, you know that there's probably still going to be funding for this and for the people who take these jobs working at it. That's of high value to the agency, to the public, and to the industry.
Thank you very much.
Amelia, I would also just add too, you know, we're talking about thousands of people that are involved and are supported through the user fee funds. And so I just think it's worth noting, it's not like you flip a switch. Today it's on, tomorrow it's off. So as Jeremy mentioned, there's the wind down, and what's on the other side after you've come down, you got to wind back up. And so, you know, what could potentially be lost in there could be disruption. That's why I use the term disruption in my remarks, right? That ultimately it comes back to, if the goal is to try to have as streamlined a pathway as possible for, again, those products that meet the standard, then the impact of that is it could be delays to ultimately the time then for those that could get caught with that disruption to make their way through that process.
Understood. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're about to come to the end of today's event. So with these last few minutes, I'd like to ask each of you to provide, just give you an opportunity for some brief closing remarks or key takeaways from this conversation on user fees. Jeremy?
I will just say, I sort of said, this is a great place where bipartisan policymaking happens. It's a great example of when you find ways to make compromise, to make policy move forward, sometimes in the direction I like, sometimes in the direction I don't like. But it's a really good thing to embrace and keep going and utilize as we go along. And it's a place where the common interests of the public, the industry, and the government line up nicely. Even if there are disagreements about emphasis within that. And I think that's something for.
Thank you, Jeremy. John?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jeremy. I really hope that holds this go around. I mean, you know, in 2017, it was a pretty politically contentious time, and we got this done. And again, off the House floor on the suspension calendar with a voice vote. I don't see that happening this go around. I think obviously, you know, that this is going to pass, but a lot of education needs to occur. There are a lot of members in both chambers where, you know, they'll just start hearing about the UFAs, you know, over the next couple of months. And that, you know, you can't just intuitively hope that these folks understand how sacrosanct and critically important these programs are to, you know, patients and consumers. So I would urge everyone, to the extent they can, to educate as many lawmakers as possible, so folks understand what this otherwise, you know, esoteric package that's coming to that the House and Senate floor actually entails.
Thank you. Anna.
Well, I think we've all consistently hit this theme about just how integral these programs are for FDA's ability to fulfill its mission to protect and promote public health on behalf of patients and consumers. And so they're clearly very, very important. It has a real impact on patients. We've seen over the course of the 30 years the impact these programs have had on public health, and as well as the potential that they could hold, looking forward. And so I also view the reauthorization of these programs as a great opportunity. It's an opportunity for patients. It's an opportunity to continue, a very collaborative dialogue around how to optimize work that is so critical to patients and public health.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists today for their insights on user fees, and to our audience for joining us today and helping make this event a success. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have today. Before you sign out, please take the time to complete a brief evaluation survey that you'll receive immediately after the broadcast ends via email. Please keep an eye on the Alliance website for details about other exciting upcoming events. And last but not least, a recording of the webinar and additional materials will be available on the Alliance website. So this concludes today's webinar on FDA user fees. Andy, Anna, Jeremy, and John, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your insights, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.